Okay. Welcome to Friday Live here at Way Valley Academy, streaming across authentic education. My name is Ava and I am pleased to introduce BBC Antiques Roadshow expert Paul Atterbury as our guest speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ava. It's great to be with you, Paul, today.
And you, Mark.
Lovely. And welcome to Way Valley Academy. And welcome to everybody out there watching this wonderful live streaming today across authentic education. So, Paul, tell us about your career and why you think careers are so important and your slant on that.
Well, I think I should start by saying I still don't really know what I should do when I grow up, which means that I didn't plan to have a career at all. And you could actually say, have I had a career? And in the sense, it was something that went straight through from the beginning to the end. Well, not quite the end yet, I hope. No, I never did. I never knew what I wanted to be. And, you know, when I was your sort of age, I worried about this because I thought, oh God, you know, I've got to decide what I want to do. I hadn't a clue. And school didn't push me in any particular direction. And looking back, I think that was absolutely great because it meant that I could go anywhere I wanted. And even if I didn't know where it was, there was a sense that I didn't have to go and be what I'd chosen to be or what my education drove me towards or my GCSEs or any of that. You know, it was slightly different in my time, but there was a point where you chose which GCSEs or equivalent you wanted to do. It was A-levels in my case. And in a sense, at that point, your career or your life seemed to be programmed. And it took me a while to realize, no, you know, you were not locked into that route in any way whatsoever. I mean, for my A-levels, I did what were called modern languages, which was French and German. And apart from going to France on holiday, you know, I've never spoken or used it since. No. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Brilliant. And do you feel that there was, so when you were at school, so you've just sort of said to everybody that, you know, obviously you choose what you want to do really, because it doesn't really matter, you know, which line you follow.
Or it chooses you.
Or it chooses you. Can you say a bit about that? It chooses you.
I mean, I realized quite early on that to some extent I was in charge of my fate. And it was up to me to do things that I wanted to do, even if they weren't very clearly defined. And I learned to have it very, very early on, which always stood me in good stead, which is if somebody says to you, would you like to do this? Unless it's really crazy and completely out of the question, just say yes. Because if you say no, you'll never know what it was like. If you say yes and it worked, great. If you say yes and it doesn't work, well, you can always back out. But the great thing is to try. And so within reason, just think about going through life saying yes to things. Most of the things I've done came about because suddenly something completely different pops up. Yes. Somebody says, how about doing this? And you think, oh, why not?
Yes.
Rather than, oh, I don't think I can do that.
Yeah.
You've got to go and think, I'll give it a go.
So would you say to students, you know, to embrace opportunities for work experience and things like that?
Anything. It doesn't really matter what, at this stage, it doesn't matter what you do. I mean, if you know at this point, I'm going to be a horse vet or something which has a clear career profession, a doctor, then clearly there needs to be some relevance.
Yes.
But most of us, I mean, some of you may be in that position, you know what you want to do. Most of us, you like me, hadn't a bloody clue. Sorry, hadn't a clue.
Yes, yeah.
And therefore, you embrace whatever comes.
Yes, yes.
And it's just pushed me on from crazy thing to crazy thing.
Yes. Yeah. Could you say a bit more about your career in terms of the opportunities that came your way, you know, where you felt like you did really embrace those opportunities and tried out something?
Okay. Very briefly, I went off to university and college where I was going to study English. I didn't get on with it. And so after a year, I dropped out.
Yes.
You know, so, and even that wasn't a disaster because I realized I'd made a mistake.
Right.
It wasn't, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but it wasn't that.
Yeah.
So I didn't fail.
No.
It just didn't work.
Yes.
And I think it took me a while to be brave enough to actually say, I'm going to leave.
Right.
Because I didn't tell my parents until I'd done it and all that sort of thing.
Yes.
Because it was quite frightening to think, you know, I'm throwing up the chance of something I've worked for. So I then went off and did something different. In fact, I trained to be a graphic designer. which I did for a while. And from that, I drifted really into publishing and worked as a editor, as all sorts of things, and spent a lot of time in the publishing world. Now, I'd never planned to go that way. It just sort of logically flew. So in the beginning, you began designing books, and then you ended up editing books.
Yes.
And then you ended up writing books. And all of that was completely unpredictable.
Yes.
And then there's a certain point when I suppose, what was called a mature student, I thought, I've really missed out on university or college. I'll go back. And so entirely, I made all the arrangements myself. I was 24. I thought, I'm going to do this again, do it properly this time. And I went to another university, did a completely different course, which I liked the sound of, which is called art history, which was then quite a sort of new subject. And I was thinking, I had no interest in career. I thought, I'm going to do this because I want to do it. And what happens next is what happens next. And it sort of took me out of the running for 3 years. I didn't have to think about what happens next. And suddenly I thought, God, it's going to end. What now?
What now?
And so I drifted back into publishing again. So that career pattern was very uncertain and unresolved. And I was lucky and unlucky in a way, in the sense that neither of my parents had been to university. Therefore, they didn't really know what was going on. And they couldn't say, oh, you have to do this or you have to do that. And so I was making my own choices. And some were bad, but most were good, as it turned out.
Brilliant. And can you, because in the room we've got some history students and we've also got obviously some performing arts students, which is absolutely fantastic. So could you talk a bit now about your career with BBC Antiques Roadshow, because we've also got the link here obviously with history and the provenance of objects, but also of course with performance really in the BBC. So.
Well, I was always interested in history. I didn't study it, but it was something that I'd always been, since a child, I'd always been interested in history and whatever it meant. And I don't know why it never occurred to me to study it, but I didn't. And so that interest was there. I wasn't involved. I mean, apart from school plays and things like that, I had no interest really in performing arts. I mean, when I did plays, I thought, oh, this is fun. And I liked actually standing on the stage and doing whatever I got to do. But it never occurred to me to take it seriously. You know, it was just something that one did at that point. And but what I learned from that, obviously, was at quite a young age, I'd reached the point where I could stand up there and do things without being terrified. And that really stood me instead in a good position for the future. Not to have a fear about performing, but I wasn't going to be a performer. You know, it wasn't a career choice at all. And I was interested in antiques because my parents were interested in antiques. I wasn't particularly addicted, but I grew up in a house filled with what they politely called junk, you know, which is fair enough. It wasn't great stuff. It was things they liked. And I began to share that interest a bit. And in my teens, late teens, I became sufficiently interested to start collecting in a minor way. But I very quickly learnt that, you know, you can buy a pot that you're interested in or you like, but actually what interested me was who made it, why did they make it, what did they sell it for, what was the market, what was the thinking behind this object. Every object, you know, when you sit at your breakfast table and you're using whatever is there, someone has thought about making that bowl, making that cutlery. And why did they do it? And did it work? Did it not work? All that suddenly seemed to be much more interesting. And then I realized that the objects are only interesting because of what they can tell you. I mean, okay, it's a pretty bowl. But how did it get there?
That's right.
And so I didn't really collect very much. I then began much more interested in writing about it, which I'd begun to do by then. And talking about it and giving talks. And so all that, but that wasn't a career. I was still working in publishing companies. This was something I was doing on the side. And at no point did I ever think, ooh, this is a new career opening up. It was a hobby. An interest. And I ploughed on. And I enjoyed books, you know, I enjoyed everything about it. And I'd begun to write a bit by then. But I wasn't sort of suddenly seized by a passion thinking, I'm going to be a writer. It wasn't like that at all. I was given work to do. Like writing an essay. we need you to write this book about whatever it might be. Okay, I said.
Yes.
I mean, somebody, for example, very early in my career rang up and said, we're just about to write, we've decided to, it was a small publisher who did guidebooks. And he rang up and he said, we're thinking of doing a book about the Thames and we need someone to write it and edit it.
Yes.
Would you be interested? Now, this is a classic case. I had no experience of it. So the obvious thing was to say, I don't think so. I just said yes.
Yes.
Thinking, God knows what's going to happen, but, let's go with it.
Yes.
And he said, that's good news. Well, it was then late August. And he said, what you need to know is this book needs to be in the bookshops by next February.
Right.
So this meant all the researching and walking and everything. I walked the length of the Thames. I did lots of things. Had to be done in the middle of winter.
Right.
And believe it or not, I was still working in other ways. And it seemed to be a completely impossible task.
Yeah.
And if I hadn't been 23, I'd have said, it can't be done. But I thought, why? He knows what he's doing.
Yes.
I'll go with it.
Yeah.
And we did.
Brilliant.
The book came out in February the following year, in February 1969. And the point was, what I learned from it was great fun to do. I was very much on my own, a lot of it. There were other people in the office who I worked with and helped. But essentially, the production and content of the book was down to me.
Yes.
And this was, I realized, was a fantastic learning opportunity. And what it taught me about anything else was about deadlines. It had to be done. There was no way you could miss that deadline. Because if you missed that deadline, they'd have to have waited a year to publish the book. Right. Books like that have to come out in the early spring. And so it taught me a great deal. And also, this page is about whatever it is. We need 250 words to fit this hole. Yes. So you write 250 words. You don't write 350 or 150 because that's just wasting everybody's time. You've got to do it. Yes. As the spec.
And that really links, doesn't it, also with timing on like the BBC shows and things like that.
Yeah.
Antiques Roadshow. I mean, you've got a certain time limit. I know they edit and things like that, but actually it's a certain time slot, isn't it?
And this, again, takes us back to performing, really, because you're given something to do and you know the parameters, you know the boundaries. And if you mess it up, for whatever reason, basically you've messed it up. Yes. There's no coming back from it. That's right, and you learn that, because if you messed it up, you're disappointing yourself, but you're really messing up other people. Yes. In a much bigger way. Yes. If you just haven't got a grip on it. And the BBC stuff came about again entirely by chance because I had no television background at all. And furthermore, I had no ambition. Yes. My mum worked in television, in children's television, when I was growing up. Right. And I never thought, that's exciting. I'd like to do that. I watched her doing it because in those days, television was live. There was no recording. Yeah. So sometimes when I was very small, I used to go to the studio in Alexandra Palace and watch. She was a puppeteer. She was doing children's puppet programs. And I'd sit there where you are. She'd be there doing it. And I'd think, that's interesting. And if something went terribly wrong, just dealt with it. Yes. You couldn't say, stop, try again, because it was tuned into the world. Yeah,
that's right. It was live.
And you had to cope.
Yes, yeah.
And I remember, when I was still doing student drama, if you forgot your lines or something happened, you just had to plough on. Yes. And cope with it.
Totally.
Yes, and that was actually a great learning experience.
Yes.
And so that television background didn't really have any impact on me at all. I was interested in a program called the Antiques Roadshow, which started in 1978, because of the subject matter. Yes. And I just saw these people looking at interesting things. It isn't about, gosh, this vase is worth £5,000. No. It's actually about what can you tell about this vase? And more important, you, the owner, why have you got it? Yes. What's the family story? Yes. And so it was a shared conversation about, what the vase can tell both of us. Yeah. I can tell its history. You can tell me what your granny said when she gave it to you.
Totally.
Whatever it might be. And what your granny said might have been completely untrue. Yes. And you've got to cope with the fact that she meant well, but got it wrong.
Yes. I think that's really interesting for the audience here about the history of objects as well, and actually their provenance, their importance, but also about what they mean to somebody in terms of memory or loss or sentimental value. Do you want to say something about that?
Oh, yes, because, I mean, so often, I mean, every object in this room, the piano, the screen, you know, what you've got in your pockets, the clock, something can be said about every single one of them.
Yes.
And some of it's quite boring and tedious. It was made by so-and-so in a certain date and all that stuff. But if you suddenly realize that, you know, my great aunt or your great aunt or somebody's great aunt used that piano, and she performed in the Royal Albert Hall or something in a concert, or she was a jazz pianist, or whatever it might be, or a popular music entertainer, and suddenly that's not just a piano, it's a piano that's gone through all sorts of things. And those stories are, so it's two layers. It's the basic stuff about who made it and when and why, and then what happened to it. You know, and there might have been a drama, like, you know, they lived in a house in the Second World War and the house was bombed, but the piano survived. You know? And when we're talking to people, all this comes out. And so, as a historian, which I think I primarily am, I love all that. Because you're going into other people's lives. You know, you've all got great stories to tell already about who you are, what you've done, what your family is and has been and will be. And this is the meat and core of all of this stuff. I think.
I think that's a really good point to make, isn't it? About, you know, that you've probably got objects at home, you know, in your house, your family have different objects, and who knows their history or their importance. And it may be their value, but value, that word is important.
But value is about what it is. I mean, okay, there is a financial element. I mean, you know, like me, I mean, you've all probably got one of these in your pocket. Now, we take this for granted. But if I mean, hopefully you'll all still be here in 30 years, I certainly won't be, but by that time, this will be history. No one will know what you do with it or what you did with it. We'll no longer be able to use it because the technology will have changed. It's become a bit of history. And, you know, I learned the other day, I mean, probably a lot of you have still got landlines at home. Well, a national landline network is going to be turned off at the end of 27.
That's right,
And therefore, you suddenly won't have that. So you won't be able to pick up the phone at home and ring somebody up. It'll have gone. And therefore, a home telephone becomes a bit of history. What is it? It's useless. You can't use it. But what did it tell us about our lives? And, you know, I go back to things like coin boxes. You know, we didn't always have phones at home. You went out and you put pennies into a machine. And if you were lucky, it worked. It was terribly erratic.
If I had to ask you the question, which is, what is the most exciting find that you've ever seen on the Antiques Roadshow? And it may not be one that's to do with value in a financial sense, but it might be something that really you've thought a lot about since discovering it.
I mean, I've been on the roadshow for 35 years, and obviously I've seen hundreds, thousands of things, most of which I've completely forgotten about. Because it comes, it goes, it moves. But obviously there are things that stick in your mind. One example, now, I can't remember the exact date, in the late 18th century, Captain Cook, from a British point of view, discovered Australia, right? He wasn't the first there because the Dutch had been there, but we needn't go into that. And he had a ship called the Endeavour. And we did film a roadshow in Australia, in Sydney and Melbourne. And a man came in with a big wooden box, a very smart wooden box with handles. And he put it down and he opened it. And inside was a very polished lump of wood. Very square, like a big brick, basically. And it sat in the box, which had been made for it. And it looked very smart, but basically it was a piece of wood. It was a log, a smart log. And I looked at him and he said, well, I said, why have you brought me a log? And he said, well, it's a very special log because this is a piece of the keel of Captain Cook's ship, the Endeavour. And I said, come on, you know, why? And he said, I've done all the research. When ships, not so much today, but in wooden ships, when they finish the end of their lives, they're taken to pieces and all the bits go into another ship. And he tracked down that when the Endeavour was broken up in whatever date, I can't remember, most of the pieces the big bits, the keel and so on, went into another ship called something else. That then had a 30-year lifespan. And again, when that ship was broken up, somebody remembered that bits of Captain's Cook's ship are in this. We better remember that. And it went into another ship. And that took us to the 1840s or 50s. And at that point, somebody thought, we mustn't just keep using this wood. It's really important. And so this chunk was cut out by somebody in the 1850s. And it then was passed down various generations as a piece of the endeavour. And this man had done the background, and the story all made sense, because provenance is all. You know, I could go and get a piece of wood and said, you know, this came from the Victory. But unless you can prove it with documentation, this is where history comes in. And he'd done all the work. And there it was. And you think, blimey, you know, this is... And in Australian terms, it's the crown jewels. You know, the first part of modern British, modern Australian history starts with that ship. And there it was.
Wow.
And I'm excited by it then, I was excited by it now. And what's it worth? Well, in that case, I thought, God, it's a piece of wood, what's it worth? And I asked my colleagues, we often do this, what do you think? And they all came up with crazy ideas. Normally the pricing and the values are based on auction house prices. So you've got something concrete. Nobody's ever seen anything like this. And I thought, well, in Britain, it would probably be nothing, you know, 100 quid or something. There, and I said something, and I said, basically, most people said, you can say whatever you like, it doesn't matter. So I think I said $250,000. Meaningless, really, in the sense that, A, he's not going to sell it. And it's a complete guess. But it's so important as a piece of history. And so that's something really ordinary, like a piece of wood, can suddenly become really important. And even touching it, you thought, gosh, you know, this goes back to that moment when he landed.
So important, isn't it? That sense of
and that's what we get. That's the pleasure of it.
Yes, you're right. It's the pleasure of it, isn't it? And actually, what it becomes, an object becomes illuminating, doesn't it? It comes up with
read it. I mean, the object is sitting there. Unless you can interpret it and reveal that story, the whole program is based on telling those stories. I mean, you know, you could come up with a bottle or glass or something which is sitting there with no story. It's got nothing to say other than who made it and when. Put in those stories. And it's really gripping, or can be.
So put in those stories, and let's talk about that, everyone, in terms of, we're going to open up into questions shortly, but just quickly, Paul, what would you say in terms of people wanting careers, or our students here, how far would you say that ambition and resilience is pretty important for them?
Well, I think I'd almost put resilience first. Because you can have ambition. I mean, you've all got ambitions to do different things, whatever it might be, not necessarily career related, and you can fulfill those or not. But resilience is sticking to it, thinking, I've got this crazy idea. I'm going to. I mean, I was very lucky because I didn't have parents who said, "Oh, you can't do that." Partly because I didn't tell them what I was going to do. And secondly, because I knew they'd probably be quite negative about it anyway. And so a lot of my activities, I wasn't being secretive. I just thought, I know what I want to do. I'll do it. And if it doesn't work, I'll shut up. And that resilience was thinking, it's exactly like that book I told you about. You start on it, you know it's got to be done, and you just go on and on and on until it's done. So that is important. But equally, the ambition was when somebody says, would you like to do this? The answer can be no. But if you think, oh, that sounds interesting, that's the ambition. You think, oh, I bet I can do that. You know, I bet I can stand on that stage and perform. I bet I can do all these things. And until you've tried it, you don't know.
Brilliant. It's that sort of curiosity, isn't it, as well?
You know, if there's one word which defines, I don't call it a career, my life, it's curiosity. I'm curious about all of you and what you do and what you think, about you, about the piano. I'm eternally curious. And I think once you've lost that curiosity, give up.
Brilliant. We're now going to open up to questions from the audience
About anything.
about anything within reason, anything to do with what's been said today, or other questions that you might have for Paul today. Can we please have some volunteers with any questions that people would like to ask over here? Any questions?
Otherwise, I'll ask you a question.
Yes. Have we got any questions that we can ask? Any questions? Okay, I've got one then. And my question is, if you want to specialize in antiques, what period would it be for you? And what objects?
Well, I think, I mean, more recent history. You know, I'm interested in the Tudors in a sort of general sense, but it's so distant, it's actually hard to relate to. But what was going on in the partly in my lifetime, don't say what was going on in the 1950s and 60s is great.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I went to view a sale in Sherborne the other day, and they had some photographs, informally taken photographs, signed by the Beatles.
Right.
And you think, oh, how did that come about? And obviously, you know, lots of people at that point went and saw the band and queued up and got autographs, what have you. These were different. They were very, you know, it was just like a snap of the four of them together. Quite early on in 63 or 64.
Yeah.
And I found out, because I was curious, that they'd had a roadie at that point that they were traveling with, who worked with them for several years.
Yes.
And he'd taken the photographs. And because he was with them all the time. And they'd signed them for him. So suddenly, it's not just a fan's picked up an autograph. It's suddenly become very personal.
Yes.
And so I think that sort of history really is 20th century history, if you like, is the most exciting, because it's tangible.
It's tangible, isn't it? And I know that obviously historians in the room studying the 20th century would be really interested in that how objects can link to a period of history. And I think, you know, with a story that's to be told, isn't it? And I think everybody in here, honestly, we sort of, in drama, we can, you know, use objects in drama and performing arts, and their history can come alive through a dramatic performance.
I mean,
you know,
so many plays are based on that. Any historical drama
definitely
is using history.
Yes,
in a constructive way.
And how writers use history, isn't it, as well? You know, or paintings such as Tracy Chevalier.
There for us all to step into.
Yeah,
I'm going to ask Eva a question.
Yeah.
Why do you want to be a performing artist?
I don't really know. It's kind of just a thing that I feel like I'm good at, and then I just want to do it when I'm older.
And how are you going to do it?
I don't know.
I mean, are you going to go to a college? Are you going to be trained?
I want to do GCSE for hair.
Yeah.
And then I'll try and find something that I can do somewhere else.
And will you take anything that gets you into that world?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very important question, because you think, okay, I'm going to be an actor. I'm going to get a job in a performing company. You might only get a job as a stagehand. It doesn't matter. You've got to get into the world you want to get into on any level. Because once you're in, you can then progress. If you don't get in, you can't get started. And that's why, you in a sense, you've got to meet opportunity halfway. And, you know, if you want to work in the arts, you might have to start being a volunteer doing something. It doesn't matter, because all that experience is as valuable as going to college. And lots of great actors and performers have never been near a college. But they've got in at some point. They've developed a talent, and their career has taken off. And I think you've just got to be open to opportunity in whatever field you want to do. I mean, you know, you're all doing work experience of some kind or another at some point. Is that right? Yeah. And it doesn't really matter what you do, because it's about experience in the working environment. But you know, it could be something that leads you nowhere. It could be something that makes you think, oh, this is interesting. I'd like to do more of this. And you can, because you've already had that. You've already got your foot sort of through that door by doing the work experience. You could equally say, this has been the most boring week of my life. I certainly don't want to do that. But at least you've learned to make that judgment that this is something you really don't want to do. Because the work experience environment, going into a work situation is completely different to anything you've ever done here. You work at school, but it's totally different because you've got all sorts of group dynamics to deal with. You've got timing, you've got all sorts of things which are new. And I think that's why it's so important. And just take what you can out of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was excellent. And I think what we've looked at today, everyone, is that real link, haven't we, between history and also with performing, you know, those sort of two strands that we've looked at. So not only using history and the provenance of objects and things like that, which Paul has talked about, but also how presenting and talking about them in front of an audience is absolutely key. I do a lot of work like that as well, obviously with the Records Office, you know, in Dorchester, with the History Centre, Dorchester History Centre, where they've got lots of documents, you know, from the past and from writers and things like that, such as the Sylvia Townsend Warner collection.
Can I just say, I mean, when I started being a writer, I mean, sometimes when you fill in a questionnaire saying profession, I never quite know what to put, so I put various things. Sometimes it's writer, sometimes it's historian. You know, it's never anything to do with television, because television is something I'm doing. It's a very small part of my life, and I think my start as a proper writer, in the sense that I write books, came about exactly what you just said. Suddenly finding the documents are the interesting thing, rather than the object.
Right.
The object is there, but without the documents, it's fairly meaningless. And I've had lots of experiences of dealing with that. I mean, one particular pottery factory I worked on as their history. The first thing you do, what do? You get in touch with the family, if there is a family, and you talk to them. They tell you what it was like working in the factory and whatever. And so I talked to this lady who was the daughter of the man who'd run the factory. And she told me tons of stuff. And I thought, great. And so I wrote the book on that. And about 20 years later, the book was rewritten because more information had come to hand. And I had access suddenly to a whole archive of privately held family papers, which no one had ever seen.
Right.
And it was a laundry basket. And it was full of everything. It had petrol bills, really significant contracts. Everything had just been dumped in here.
Wow.
But the most important thing I learned from it, I rewrote the book because within that paper, which I sorted out, were clear documentary indications that nearly everything I'd been told by the family was incorrect.
Right.
It was family stories that had developed over generations, and it was not borne out by the paperwork.
No.
And that happens quite often. You know, we've all got family stories. And there's this thing called Chinese whispers. You know, you tell me a story, you tell somebody else. By the time it's got to the person over there, it's completely changed. You can play that game yourselves. And without the documents, you end up with nonsense.
Yes.
And this is what had happened in that case. It was tricky to deal with because she was still alive.
Right.
And, you know, how do you tell somebody that everything your father told you is actually untrue? And it was hard work.
That's hard, isn't it?
Didn't go down well, I think.
No, because it's so sort of
it's so personal,
isn't it?
And it was all her memories have been challenged by me. And I say, it's not me. Look, here's a piece of paper which says something different. So the documents in the History Centre or wherever are riveting. And I mean, again, I'll just tell you something I've been working on recently. Again, there was a once very famous ceramic designer who worked at Poole called Truda Carter. And for some reason, she vanished from history from the 1950s. She died in 1958 and vanished. And there's no information about her at all. There is no documents, no photographs. She ceased to exist. She became a non-person after her death. And no one really knew why. And it's just been accepted. And I thought, this isn't good enough. You know, she was a great designer. Why isn't she famous? And this is an indication that because somebody, for various reasons, wiped her out, she ceased to be famous. She ceased to exist. Her reputation had gone. Because there were no documents to support it.
No.
And I've been looking her up in the history. I found out enough to tell her story. But there's still a great mystery about what happened to her. And that's why the document's so important. If you throw away the document, you know,
Yes.
we're all going to lose our history.
Yes.
And once it's gone, you can't get it back.
No, no.
And it's just family stuff, whatever.
Yes, yes.
Well, I think everybody would agree today that this has been a fascinating talk. And we also want to thank everybody watching across Authentic Education today for our live speaker, our guest speaker today, Paul Atterbury from the BBC Antiques Roadshow. Could we have a round of applause, please, for Paul Atterbury? Thank you.
Thank you all